You asked, and the ACR listened. ACR and ARP have reimagined their membership model to bring you a member experience like never before. The new model includes simplified membership categories, a personalized member center, and seamless access to your member profile and benefits. Be on the lookout for more details coming soon. Learn more at rheumatology.org. ACR and ARP, where membership meets excellence. Hello, and welcome to ACR Journals on Air podcast. I'm your host, Vicky Shamagam. Today is a very special episode because we identified our guests and topic based on listener feedback for the first time. The manuscript we will discuss today is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on early career investigators in rheumatology, recommendations to address challenges to early research careers. It was recently published in Arthritis Care and Research, and a link to the manuscript and disclosures are in our show notes from today. I'm excited to be joined by two of the manuscript's authors, both fabulous physicians, thoughtful scientists, and excellent mentors. Dr. Christine Kuhn is the Scoville Endowed Chair and Head of the Division of Rheumatology and an Associate Professor of Medicine, Immunology, and Microbiology at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus in Aurora, Colorado. She received her MD and PhD in immunology at the University of Colorado. She then completed an internal medicine residency, chief residency, and rheumatology fellowship at Barnes Jewish Hospital and Washington University in St. Louis. In 2013, Dr. Kuhn returned to the University of Colorado to establish her independent research program examining the interactions between the intestinal microbiome and immune responses in inflammatory arthritis. And Dr. Liana Frankel is well known to our listeners because several prior guests have mentioned her as a key mentor in their careers. Indeed, one of our listeners told us that we needed to invite Dr. Frankel on the show, and so I was so delighted that she accepted our invitation today. Dr. Frankel's research interests lie in applying scientifically rigorous approaches to understanding patient and physician decision-making. Her studies have explicitly investigated disparities in drug utilization in different racial groups, and she's been using the fuzzy trace theory and investigating how this impacts decision-making regarding drugs with significant risk of toxicity. Welcome to the show, Christy and Liana.
Thank you for having me here to discuss this meaningful topic.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
So, Christy, I wanted to start the discussion with you and introduce your role at the ACR. You've been the chair of the ACR Committee on Research for several years. Could you tell us how you started volunteering and why you continue to do so? And then tell us what the Committee on Research does.
Yes. So I started as a micro-volunteer on a working group to establish a new grant for physician scientists who are during their training years as medical and graduate students. And at the time I had been transitioning from fellow to early faculty member, and I was utilizing opportunities during the rheumatology research workshop and annual meeting to let ACR leaders know at that time what I was passionate about. It was the physician scientist workforce. That opened opportunities and continues to do so. The topic remains one of my central professional purposes and keeps me active with the ACR. The Committee on Research itself focuses on all aspects of research relevant to the ACR and ARP membership. Our key activities include session proposals for convergence, including the basic and clinical research conferences, working with the Government Affairs Committee to advocate for more funding, collaborations with the NIH and its institutes, and having subcommittees like the Early Career Investigator Subcommittee who organizes the Rheumatology Research Workshop.
And one of the things that the ACR has been really working hard on in recent years is diversifying the makeup of their committees so that the committees really better reflect our membership. Can you tell us what that looks like for the Committee on Research?
Yes, for us, we aim to have a committee balanced based on geography, area and type of research, stage of career, and training background. Our committee represents adult and pediatric rheumatology, basic through outcomes research, clinical and non-clinical researchers, and national and international backgrounds. We want to ensure that all aspects of research within the field of rheumatology are well represented on the committee.
Yeah, so important. And do you have any tips for people who might want to serve either on the committee on research or any other committee in the ACR in future years? Can you tell us a little bit about the nomination and selection process?
Yes, thanks for asking that. Nominations open in March, and one of the questions I frequently get asked is whether you have to have someone nominate you or if you can self-nominate. I encourage people to self-nominate if they're interested in any committee. And we're asking essentially on each application to submit a CV and some questions about your experience, why you want to be on that particular committee, what expertise and contributions can you make to that committee.
Yeah, and I would encourage, as people are considering applying, the responses to those questions are really important because that's how the Committee on Nominations get to know you and what you're passionate about and where you can best serve the community of rheumatology. And so kind of share your passion in trying to get good people involved. Liana, I wanted to bring you in now. You're part of the team that helped orchestrate this study. Could you share how you got involved with this research?
Yeah, sure. I think the first discussions actually were at the level of the Scientific Advisory Council at our foundation. And I can actually remember Dr. Kuhn sitting across from me as we were discussing this issue. And we were keenly aware that the pandemic had a really major impact in multiple ways, as we all know. But we heard from trainees at various levels about the difficulties handling their research projects, basically anything from recruiting patients because studies have been completely shut down to getting into the lab, et cetera. And, we were really concerned about how can we help? Not just basically how can we describe the problem, but really how can we help? And we want to also make sure that we weren't closing ourselves off to other ideas. So around the table, basically, the discussion was how to best do this. And as usual, we wanted to gather the best data possible. And so the idea was to do a mixed method study where we both would try to gain as much knowledge about ideas that we weren't particularly thinking about around our table, really do some purposeful sampling and hear from our trainees what they were concerned about, and also try to quantify those responses to get some idea about what were the major barriers that our foundation and the ACR could help facilitate to ensure that our pipeline remained robust and that we retained those who really wanted to stick with a research career.
Yeah, and actually, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your experience volunteering with the Rheumatology Research Foundation. How did you get involved with that group? What roles have you taken on for them over the years? And do you have any tips for our listeners who might want to give back to the community of rheumatology through the foundation?
Well, that would be an absolute and total pleasure because our foundation has really been an absolute highlight in my career. So I was first really lucky to get funded by the foundation. And I can remember, unfortunately, many years ago now, I can remember how tough it was to get funded. And I remember when I was applying to foundation that one of the things that I found really most appealing and most encouraging was that I knew that if I really wrote a good grant, that I had a very good chance of getting funded. And that to me has been an enduring theme with the foundation, and especially compared to other funding agencies where you can write a very good grant and just because of the number of people submitting to very large government agencies, even if you do your job and you do your best, there's a really good chance you're not going to get funded. And that can be tough, and it can be really tough now when the work-life balance is even harder. So for me, that was actually a really very positive thing. And I think it really encouraged me just to stick with it. The other really important thing for me about our foundation was the fact that I could submit ideas that were not typically funded by other government foundations, which was really important. I think when you just read my blurb of what I do things that are not traditionally funded by the NIH. And our foundation was willing to look at the ideas I had because they were very centric to its mission, which is really at the end of the day to ensure that our patients get the best possible care and have the best possible outcomes. So for both of those reasons, I've really been indebted. I've been funded several times with the foundation, and they're really, without the foundation, I would not have had my career. And as everybody knows, I tend to exaggerate a lot, but that is no exaggeration. I would very strongly encourage people to get involved because it's a total joy. The foundation basically is dedicated towards raising money so that we can train rheumatologists to take care of our patients, and so we can invest in very high quality research so we know how best to take care of our patients. I mean, there is no more joyful way to volunteer than that. It's a wonderful organization. They've been just extremely successful over the years, and they are just completely focused on the things that are important to, I think, all rheumatologists in this country. So I'm hoping that all the people who are listening to this podcast and are really invested in patient care, and clearly all those who are going to listen to this are also very invested in mentoring, really encourage you to get involved and support the foundation that's really going to be taking care of our patients for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and I think that's so important because people can give and give back in so many ways, right? Monetary gifts, but also gifts of time, gift of experience and knowledge. And those gifts mean so much to the foundation. So, Christy, I'm going to circle back to you. Tell us how you brought the team together to work on this particularly thorny issue. And what was the background of this study as you started to work on it?
Yeah, so as Dr. Frankel was just saying, we're hearing stories through the Committee on Research and through my position as chair on the committee. I sit on a couple committees with the foundation, and we were hearing these stories about how COVID had essentially put almost all non-COVID related research on hold during those couple of years. And hearing these anecdotal stories about trainees, early career investigators, established investigators, how individuals were struggling to obtain data for their abstracts, their manuscripts, their grant submissions was quite concerning to us. And so we decided to bring together representatives from the early career subcommittee, the Committee on Research, different aspects of the foundation, the Scientific Advisory Council, as well as the board, to formally study what we could do as part of the college and foundation to help our workforce.
And tell us a bit about how you defined early career investigators for this study. And then kind of second part to that question, you used a couple different distribution lists to capture responses from as many people as possible. Can you tell us about that survey distribution process?
Yeah, the definition of early career investigator for this purpose was broadened. Traditionally, the ACR and ARP defines early career investigator as within 5 years from their terminal training. But considering that we were doing a little bit of a retrospective look back over the prior couple of years going into the pandemic, we wanted to capture individuals who would have still been early career during those years. And so we wanted individuals from 2018 to the 2021 period when we sent out the survey to have belonged in that early career or even training period. And so we contacted individuals that were ACR or ARP members registered as trainees, as well as individuals who attended the rheumatology research workshop and participated in CARMA or AMIGO mentoring programs, because as participants in any of these programs, they would have met that definition of early career.
And some people may have not heard of CARMA, a great name, by the way. I believe it stands for the Creating Adult Rheumatology Mentorship in Academia program. Can you tell us what it is and how people can get involved with that program?
Yeah, CARMA is a result from the early career investigator subcommittee of the Committee on Research. And this developed several years ago. It's a mentoring program for research-focused fellows and early career individuals. And applications are solicited early in the calendar year. An applicant is asked about their training, their career goals, and that information is used to match them with an external mentor outside of their institution. It's a great opportunity for a later fellow or early career investigator to really start to network with a more established investigator outside of their institution. Usually it's somebody who has maybe some shared career interests or shared knowledge or career path knowledge. And it allows you to develop this lasting relationship. I've been a part of this as a mentor for the last 5 years, really since its inception. And I continue to interact with some of the first individuals that I mentored through this program. And it's really a lot of fun, at least from my perspective as a mentor. And I think the mentees get a lot out of this relationship as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. And direct to consumer marketing here, both the mentors and the mentees can, again, nominate themselves for this program, correct?
Correct. Yes.
So, listeners, the choice is yours. So, let's get back to your study. The survey was distributed in September 2021, so the fall of year 2 of the pandemic. What some might consider, and certainly for me personally, was the point of maximal resignation. Did you get a reasonable response rate? And tell us what you found.
Yeah, we had a 21% response rate to the survey, which I hear is reasonable for these types of studies. I'll caveat all of the listeners that I'm a traditional wet bench basic translational researcher. So this was me diving into a completely new area of research. And thankfully, Dr. Frankel was there to help mentor me along the way of this study. But obviously, we would have liked more responses and recognize that there may be a selection bias in the results. But I think the key takeaway finding is that COVID itself, we could attribute about 5% increase in attrition because of the COVID pandemic. And I think that's the takeaway point.
And you have a table where you outlined some of the responses to a question about how the pandemic affected academic and research careers for the respondents. They were quite emotive, and I wondered if you could share a few of those for our audience.
2 of the most personally impactful comments were about childcare and sustainability. The first quote is this. I'm just going to quote these directly from what the respondents had written into the survey. But the first starts as, I am watching my male colleagues without children continue to get consistent funding. Meanwhile, I have an unpredicted absence from work 1 to 2 days per week due to a sick child or lack of available childcare. And I think that I could really personally resonate with because I too have children, and the unpredictable absence from children having illness and not being able to find childcare reliably during this time was quite impactful. And I can imagine this wasn't just for me, but I hear this from a lot of my other colleagues here at the University of Colorado. The second one is a quote that gets to sustainability. And I think this continues to be an issue. Of course, I have no data to support that, but the quote goes as, more pressure on all aspects of academic research career. Patients are emailing constantly, more meetings, resources diverted to COVID, even grants managers, more documentation responsibilities from the IRB, more difficult to enroll patients. Everyone is tired and wants to do the minimum needed to get to the next steps. It seems like everything is just a little harder. And again, I think that really resonated a lot with me because even kind of coming out of the pandemic now, I still see a lot of my colleagues and I personally feel that things do seem a lot harder and you worry about sustainability.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I think it's really important to hear some of those narratives to really get a full understanding of what went on during that time, because it was a time when we were socially so disconnected from our community. To kind of focus now on the positive, you also asked respondents to share how the American College of Rheumatology and the Rheumatology Research Foundation might be able to help investigators who were experiencing the ripples of the pandemic impacting their careers. Could you tell us some of the overarching themes that surfaced from that question?
Absolutely. And I really want to stress that the objective of this project was to really think about how we as a community in rheumatology could help our members, especially those that are in research-related careers, with this study. And so it was very satisfying to see some themes come out that would lay the groundwork for really an action plan for the college and the foundation. The main themes centered on funding, really the availability of funding, as well as the processes that go into applying for funding and getting funding, as well as themes around mentoring and networking. And as you had alluded to, getting back to this interconnectedness we can have as a community.
And how is the ACR already using this data? What action are they taking? What is being done or will be done to support both early and mid-career rheumatologists?
I'll talk a little bit about ACR, and I'd like to let Dr. Frankel maybe talk a little bit about the foundation. I think they've done a lot of incredible things here. But from the ACR standpoint, we started a new virtual seminar series that's occurring about every 2 months. And it's open to ARP and ACR members. We encourage anybody who's a researcher, whether early, established, late, to come. It's very informal. It's a 1-hour seminar series. We usually have a theme to it, but it's unstructured discussions to really allow people to talk about their challenges, their successes, their best practices, to peer mentor, crowdsource, etc. And so far, we've received a lot of positive feedback for these seminar series. We're taking a bit of a summer break, but we'll be back on in the fall. And maybe Dr. Frankel, you want to talk about the foundation?
Yeah, it would be a pleasure. So I think what came out of this, honestly, was a lot of positive, constructive changes that we thought about. So COVID was probably, something that tipped us over the edge a little bit, but I think people have been struggling for a while now on work-life balance. And so this was really gave the foundation some impetus about thinking about some ways that could continue really to encourage and support people. And some of the practical things that we learned from the survey is the need, one, to be flexible, that we should recognize that there are times when folks will have to explain why they were away from their research for a little while, and that should be completely acceptable. The other thing we thought about more is thinking about the need for preliminary data. That was brought up a few times and was really a concrete thing that the foundation could do in terms of the specifications for different grant applications is to really relax the need for preliminary data, especially from the more junior trainees who really got impacted this on gathering preliminary data right out of fellowship. And the other thing that I think we'd like to build on is really the success of the bridge programming. So the bridge programming was really to allow people to have continued funding as they were waiting for an either K award or an R01 to get funded. These were promising applicants that, no surprise, had to resubmit for a second time, but continued to need support so that they wouldn't be overburdened or pulled away from their research time to do more clinical work. And that's been a really wonderful model. It's been very, very successful. So there's always room to think about, again, how can we ensure that trainees are supported during these more vulnerable times? So those are all very practical things that we can do to just make it a little bit easier to ensure that when you have these life interruptions, that you can keep moving ahead.
I'm interested to know also how both the ACR and the foundation support people who stepped away during the pandemic or for other reasons. Have they committed any resources to support re-engaging those individuals in rheumatology and or rheumatology research?
In terms of re-engaging people around the pandemic, the pandemic also had a serious impact on another group, which was the peri-retirement folks, right? So there was a lot of early retirements out of rheumatology as well as other physicians that were done. And this potentially had preferentially impacted some of the community doctors who were in private practice and not as protected by contracts from larger hospitals. And as one of the subcommittees now at the ACR is VERA, which we established several years ago to try to support members who want to volunteer for underinsured or not insured patients with rheumatic disease. And so we're now sort of trying to reinvigorate that subcommittee to really enable the ACR to support people who have recently retired. Really, it's to support anybody, but we're hoping that pulls in this big community of really talented physicians who might still want to give back to get re-engaged in the community and to really help with access. And so that's ongoing now. And basically the ACR will be involved by providing information, providing toolboxes on how people can volunteer and help the more vulnerable patients in their communities.
And sort of follow up to that question, and Christy, I'm going to put this to you. I appreciate that this came to the attention of the ACR because of the pandemic, but I can't help but wonder whether this was happening even pre-pandemic. We've been talking for years about the leaky pipeline, but one of the blessings of the pandemic is that it's allowed us to reevaluate reevaluate old problems with fresh eyes. And this attrition issue is one of those. Did your respondents in your survey have suggestions for re-engaging those individuals who, for whatever reason, had needed to step away for a time? One of the quotes, I think, in your manuscript was this quote about a generational loss of knowledge. And it struck me personally as one of those who did step back and someone who is not actively using my well-honed clinical skills, that failing to consider the gainfully unemployed as we address our workforce crisis is perhaps an own goal on the part of our community.
Sure. You raise very important issues around workforce that have been overlooked by many. I think some of the programs that Dr. Frankel just talked about does address how to engage some of our workforce that may have stepped away. Those that in our survey who stepped away and commented really did not leave an open door for reentry. It was really quite heartbreaking, to be honest. Some of the quotes, especially some of them that didn't make it into the manuscript, but we really need to consider our communities and how we can be better supportive for those who do take another path or to decide to take a pause, and ensure that they still feel included. And we keep that door open and we're welcoming so that we want to re-engage them when they are ready to re-engage.
Yeah, perhaps an opportunity for the ACR to look at things with new eyes. I want to spend some time now talking to the two of you about your careers. And Liana, I wanted to start with you. You have changed the lives of so many mentees, but I wanted to hear your story. Tell us about your career pathway.
Well, I guess I really owe my career to John Esdale. So he was my first mentor when I was at McGill University in Montreal. And when I think back on, I equate my career to like being on an inner tube and sort of flowing down a river and just being very, very lucky that each of those bends took me to a wonderful place. But I think back and, I ended up getting engaged in research, presenting at meetings, standing by my poster at the ACR. And I had absolutely no idea what I was doing, except that John had told me, do this and go to the ACR. And when I think back about how I sort of got to where I ended up, I think it's because John just sort of kept nudging me in these directions. I think knowing that I would enjoy the experience and, be sort of motivated to follow that career path, but I kind of didn't know it at the time. So he's a very, very clever mentor.
Yeah, the best mentors see something in us that we don't see in ourselves, right?
Yeah, exactly. Liana, why don't you try this? And it was like, it was a blast. I mean, I still remember standing by my poster and people asking me about lupus nephritis when I was a resident. It was, quite the experience, but it was a lot of fun. And I think about how he really supported me and try to remember that when I am trying to support others, because he was a very effective mentor. So that was my first recollection. And he was actually the one who told me exactly where to go after my residency. He goes, Liana, you should go here. I was okay. And then I was privileged enough to train with David Felsen at BU. And David was an amazingly supportive mentor. And most importantly, what David allowed me to do was to make my first big swerve, of which I have done several times in my career. And after sort of 3 years doing epidemiologic studies, he sort of let me go off and do this medical decision-making stuff that I was very passionate about. So that was another lesson I learned, was really enable your trainees to, yes, gain the skills, publish enough papers to get their next grant, but follow what they find particularly interesting and particularly fascinated, even if it's not anything that you have been engaged with. So that was sort of the next step. And then I ended up at Yale, really following my husband to Connecticut, and was able to have a successful career at Yale because of Joe Kraft. And I remember Joe asking me unbelievably insightful questions about medical decision-making research, where, as we all know, Joe is, an absolutely unbelievable basic scientist. And yet he was very interested and very supportive of the stuff I was doing, which was way out in left field. It was really a privilege to be in such a supportive setting. And I just, had a wonderful, wonderful community at Yale for many, many years. So basically, I think you can see that it really takes a village, and it takes being in a very supportive and positive environment to allow you to overcome these other negatives that we might run into in life, like COVID.
Yeah. And tell us what you're doing now.
Well, now I'm actually out and I'm looking out my window. I'm in Western Massachusetts in the Berkshires, which is, I think, probably one of the most beautiful places in this country. And I'm sort of taking another swerve, and I'm spending my non-clinical days now trying to figure out how to improve access to people living in rural regions of the country with very few FTE in the community.
So you're asking people to come join you in the Berkshires?
Wide
I'll
open, wide
volunteer.
open.
So you have mentored many, many people over your career. What advice do you give to people who are in a mentoring role for the first time?
That's a great question. I think the most important thing really is to listen and focus on what's really most important to this person sitting across from you. I think, honestly, if you do that, the rest flows pretty easily. I mean, we have to all be honest and talk about what it really takes. But I think as a mentor, the key is to listen, give personalized, right? Personalized advice. And at the bottom line, be really honest, because we don't want to mislead. We want to give our mentees the tools that are required to get to the next step. But the next step is really different for different people. And I think I've learned also that not everyone thinks that everything is important, and that, sometimes people will try to steer like, why are you really interested in that? Maybe you really want to do this. And those type of things, I think it's really important to get good feedback, but make sure that you're surrounded by people who are supportive of what's important to you.
Yeah. Speaking of which, how do you personally decide which projects to pursue professionally, what things to say yes to and what things to say no to?
If I'm being honest, that has really changed dramatically over my lifetime, right, in my career. So I was, I think, very representative of many people early in my career and had an extremely hard time saying no. And I still have a hard time saying no. The issue now is that I'm just more empowered to do it. I think it's really a mentor's job, honestly, to help trainees put up some barriers so that they are not pulled away. Also, I found other ways to sometimes say no, which was to replace it with something that might be more applicable to what I love to do and that might be more applicable to advancing my career. So a very practical example might be, you might not want to be a reviewer for this journal, but another one might be very applicable to what you're interested in, and you'll learn while you're doing those reviews. You might not want to be on this scientific review panel, and if you have the luxury of getting onto another one that's more related to what you're interested, again, that will be an extremely valuable experience. So sometimes it's a matter of redirecting so that it's a win-win. You can sort of pay back, but you can also learn at the same time. And the other reasons sort of to choose are to get involved in the right communities. Dr. Kuhn was saying before about the importance of networking. It's a huge reason why I enjoy so much volunteering with our foundation, right? It's just a wonderful way to spend time with people that you really learn from. It allows you to live a little bit in a different world than when you work every day. In academic medicine, we tend to be sort of a little bit siloed. So it's really nice to take a step out and live in different worlds. And that's another sort of way that you can choose what you're doing outside of your 9 to 5.
Yeah, great advice. Christy, I'm going to turn to you now. You're now running a division in Colorado. Tell us about your journey, and along the way, how have you learned different skill sets that supported you as you grew into this leadership role?
Wow, so much I've learned along the way. I will say that I wanted to be a physician scientist and a division head very early on in my career. And I'm one of those lucky individuals who had a clear vision of what I wanted to do. And as Dr. Frankel just said about what do you say yes to and what do you say no to, I really thought about how different experiences along the way would help support or distract from my goals. And that really guided me on what I would say yes to, what I would say no to. And I think the skill sets that I've learned is really taking advantage of opportunities. And so working on different research projects and research teams, I learned a lot about team management, But similarly, working in my clinic with not just seeing patients, but the interdisciplinary clinical team taught me a lot about team management. And those skills are just so cross applicable in all aspects of my day to day leadership. And so I think really for me, it's been seeing how the different experiences I've had in my life and how can I use them to inform what I do on a day to day basis.
Yeah. And your academic work is obviously very translational. So you mentor physicians and basic research scientists. Do you have tips for others who are mentoring those two different groups? Because I do think they need a slightly different set of mentoring skills.
For sure. I think with any individual that I mentor, whether medical student, graduate student, rheumatology fellow, that's a pediatrician, the key for me has always been those initial meetings and saying, okay, what are your career goals? And especially individuals earlier on in their career, they may not know what their career goals are yet. And so we really want to get down to helping them and supporting them in trying to figure out those goals and figuring out what are your interests? Where do you want to focus? How is that going to build your career? No matter what, in research, in mentoring, I think there's some core fundamentals that are the same. And then after that, it's just adapting them to the unique needs of the individual. And sometimes it requires, I've had to reach out to, for example, like the immunology program director for a PhD immunology student and find out, okay, what are the specific unique program requirements for this individual and make sure that we're hitting those milestones. It's probably not a surprise as a basic scientist that I really like to have clear objectives and paths. And so for me, kind of having those bullet points of milestones we need to hit has always been helpful to me when I mentor individuals.
And then as an MD PhD, what tips do you have for sustaining success in the physician scientist track?
Yes. I am inherently optimistic. And I think you always have to look at the glass half full. You go into being a physician scientist, a researcher. I mean, it doesn't matter what kind of research you do. And you have to have this glass half full and realize that it's kind of like baseball and a batting average of 30% is pretty darn good. So I think it's kind of a little bit of that perspective. But the other key is surrounding yourself with people like that. And I think for any individual wanting to be a physician scientist, a physician, I think it's making sure you're in an environment that's going to support you, that's going to cultivate you, and on your worst day is going to listen to you and help you get back and keep going.
Yeah, so important. So were there any mentors who personally supported you in your physician scientist and leadership journey?
Everyone who knows me knows that I give a lot of credit to Mike Hollers here at Colorado. He was a mentor to me throughout almost every single stage of my career. And he's not just supported me from a research standpoint, but just from a leadership standpoint. Anyone who has worked with him knows how generous he is with his time and his thoughts, and just really a solid mentor who understands the pathway of a physician scientist and really pushes you to think beyond your own boundaries.
Yeah, really great mentor, right? And as the chair of the Committee on Research, one of your areas of focus has really been on supporting and mentoring these junior scientists in our field. Tell us why you focused on that issue. You didn't have to. How did you decide to spend your precious energy on that?
It's my passion area. This is what I love. I think helping individuals become successful researchers is something that I have been invested in from the very earliest stages of my career. And it's something that I'm always going to be invested in. And as I finish my tenure as chair of the Committee on Research and thinking about what my next volunteer activity in the college is, I can tell you that supporting and mentoring junior scientists is going to be one of the things that'll be central to that activity for me.
Super. And I want to thank both of you, both Liana and Christy, for joining us on the show and for sharing so much wisdom and insight.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
So before we close today, I also want to thank our audience. This particular episode would probably not have happened without audience participation. So I realized we need to make that process easier for you, the listener. We're coming up on the show's first anniversary, and we would like to hear from you. What would you like us to change? How and when do you listen? And what would you like to hear more of? Our email address is podcast@rheumatology.org, and we're looking forward to receiving your messages and are curious to hear your thoughts. Thank you all for listening to this podcast. ACR Journals on Air is a production of the American College of Rheumatology. Please follow @ACRheum on social media and rate and subscribe to our podcast at acrjournalsonair.org or wherever you get your podcasts.